Well, hello, everybody. I'm Ken Alex at UC Berkeley Center for Law, Energy, and Environment. Thank you very much for sticking with us and joining us in the afternoon session here from Berkeley and elsewhere. So we have quite possibly the most difficult challenge of climate change, which is discussing financing, and not just financing for resilience, because that would be too easy, financing both for adaptation and mitigation. And we have 45 minutes to do it. So it's going to be a very quick set of solutions that will resolve the climate crisis. So to do so, I must say we have a really all-star set of panelists. As you can see, Rob Engle, Nobel economist at the Stern School of Business at NYU. Arun Majumdar is the Dean of the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability, and Nuan Taraki, Executive Director of Programs for California Forward. One quick comment before I hand it over to Rob. This is such a difficult set of challenges, and mitigation and adaptation, while they are on a continuum, sometimes things that are done as adaptation are also part of mitigation. They pose different challenges. And so financing solutions are varied and often difficult, and we want to talk about them in some nuanced ways. Just think about something like financing transmission in California. Tens of billions, maybe hundreds of billions of dollars, and decades worth of time to do it. How do we do that without destroying ratepayers? Okay, with that very joyful introduction, let me hand it over to Rob Engle.
Well, thank you, Alex. Ken, it's great to be with you today, and sorry we can't all be there in person, because it would be fun to do that. I have some slides, and maybe we should. So I'm going to talk about impact of climate change and on regions, and how to finance adaptation and mitigation. So that's the agenda that I'm going to try to discuss, and I guess I won't probably touch all the things, but we all know that the damages from climate change are going to go all over the world, but they'll be highly unequal. And California, with its wildfires, landslides, and rising sea level, is really one of the more exposed regions. So with public policy, we want to protect our citizens as much as possible. We want to protect them through adapting to the new and rising risks. But who should pay for this, and how much are they willing to pay? Is it the state, the federal government, oil and gas or electric companies, the insurance companies, citizens themselves, or collections of citizens? How do we think about this problem? Who should pay? So this is adaptation, and this picture kind of suggests who's paying for the helmet. Okay, next. So there's some sort of easy examples. In general, homeowners and investors who knew the risks but chose to purchase exposed assets should expect to pay the damages if they occur. This is the way it is in financial markets, and it kind of makes sense for it to be in housing markets. It isn't really clear that other people should guarantee them if they're living in the high-risk area that's right on the ocean, for example. They should buy insurance. And if insurance coverage is expensive or hard to get, this is a warning that the risk is high. And similarly, mortgages may be expensive, because if their property is uninsured, then the insurer is at risk. So he's going to have to charge high rates. So in a sense, it is investors who bear the risks. But for unforeseen regional disasters, that is sort of large areas and many people at the same time, we do expect government to help from both state and federal sources. It takes a little bit from everyone to support the few who've been massively damaged. And as a whole, this improves social welfare. But the next slide points out that the world is more complicated than either of those two simple examples. For example, when an asset is purchased, the risk might be low and then it goes up. Who should bear the risk in this case? Well, in finance, we argue that if there is a risk, a new risk, a risk that the risk will rise, and investors should take this into account when they buy assets. One explanation for the financial crisis is that investors didn't take this into account, the fact that volatility would go up and risks would go up was not accounted for in many of the derivatives and things were traded. These risks are, however, at a pretty high frequency. They may be trading risks or business cycle risks. Is it really the same when the risks are far in the future, such as for climate change? You know, maybe that changes things. And if we're influenced by climate deniers who say the risk is a hoax, does that forgive us from taking these risks? Does that change the answer? Well, it kind of sounds like the old excuse, the dog ate my homework. And so but it makes it a complicated issue. Ultimately, the homeowner or investor will need to pay for adapting to the rise in risks, but in some extreme cases, government help is available and sensible. But in all the rest, we're probably going to pay. Actually, Melissa Hoffer in the last panel reminded me that I should also say that many of the risks are on through public goods, in which case it's natural to expect the government to pay to fix the public goods. And so that this modifies this statement a little bit. So as a whole, we're going to pay higher insurance rates, reduce fire risks by landscaping or hardscaping, reduce heat risk by insulation and air conditioning, and we can sell the property and move to a safer neighborhood if we want. So homeowners pay in each of these examples, and as a result, become less exposed to the risks. Next slide. What about the oil and gas companies? Well, without oil and gas, the emissions would be a lot lower, but our economy would be smaller too. The legal issues of charging oil and gas for climate change are complex and still in early stages. There's probably culpability there, but it's not clear at all that the legal system is going to pay damages or pay our adaptation costs. Similarly, electric utilities have been found to be negligent in starting fires, but there are so many other ways that these fires start that even if all the power flaws are fixed, there are likely to be wildfire damages, and we're still going to be faced with landscaping issues and other ways to try to prevent damages. So as a whole, I think these avenues are unlikely to provide the relief that we need to adapt to climate change. Next. So here's an example, though, of another kind of solution. Los Angeles not only has wildfires, but it has landslides that are slow moving. One of these is in Rancho Palos Verdes, where the land is moving as much as 8.5 feet a year. So this is due to some extent to heavy rainfall, which lubricates the flow and which destroys houses and roads. So FEMA and the state of California have a voluntary property buyout program, which buys houses at risk and levels them to make permanent open space, gives the homeowner about 75% of the past appraised value adjusted for expenses and insurance proceeds and so forth. So this is federal emergency money administered locally with the homeowner bearing part of the cost. More such initiatives can certainly be put in place, I think. Next. So now I want to turn from adaptation to mitigation. And by mitigation, we're talking about decarbonizing the economy. And this is why trees are in this picture. So who's going to pay for mitigation? Next slide. Well, there are really four ways governments tend to set up mitigations plans. They tax emissions, they subsidize renewable energy, they regulate emissions and energy efficiency, or they hope. And what do I mean by hope? Well, some people call it do nothing. And it is kind of that. It also might be interpreted as hoping that the private sector will do it, even if the government sector doesn't do it. And hope is quite important here because before we get any of these policies in place, all we have is hope. And in many cases, policies are not sufficiently big and important. So hope is really a key ingredient. Next slide. So can regions do this? Well, only really if regions work together on a global scale and reduce emissions, will they be able to slow, stop, or even possibly reverse climate change? How can a region do this? The problem is free riders. What is a regional free rider? It's a region that does not bother to reduce its emissions while all other regions do, and therefore it gets the benefits of stopping climate change without incurring the costs. If all regions are free riders, then climate change doesn't slow down. So is there a way that a region can help mitigate? Next slide. So a region that chooses to decarbonize unilaterally, we could think of as a leader, a decarbonization leader. And what are the benefits of being a decarbonization leader? Well, consumers may prefer to buy from a green producer. Employees might prefer to work for a green company. Investors might prefer to hold green stocks in their portfolios. And as Tansy Whalen has pointed out, there is a return on sustainable investment that can be computed and used as part of the decision-making process for corporations. This is a way the HOPE policy gets implemented. It relies on voluntary actions of many citizens who have preferences for greenness. In other words, they don't buy the cheapest product. They might buy a more expensive product that's greener. And you're relying on goodwill and individuals making these kinds of green decisions. Next. There is another way to think about what the leader's benefits could be. How can a leader encourage other regions to be followers? Well, here's an economic example that I think could be quite important for getting other regions to follow. Suppose there are spillovers from green technology so that the cost of decarbonization will fall after one region successfully achieves it. So we're talking about a technological externality. When one company does it, all companies get the benefit of the technology. Could be that some third party sells it. It could be that information programs provided or simply trade letters. But as a consequence, other regions employ the technology. They're more likely to employ it because it's cheaper. They can see how to do it. And total emissions might fall, lowering the expected damages, that is the physical risks for all, including the leader region. So here we see spillovers in benefits as well as spillovers in costs. In the extreme case where the leader is better off by decarbonizing, we call the region the Stackelberg leader, using this concept from game theory. And in a paper by Acharya, Viral Acharya, and Olivier Wang and myself, we've actually analyzed this for corporations as Stackelberg leaders. Next slide, please. So what else can a leader do? Well, they can campaign for effective climate policies to mitigate climate change. They can elect climate-friendly representatives to push climate mitigation at the federal level. They can work with other regions to develop political power and teach other regions how to reduce emission intensity. These are all features that I think California can importantly do. Next slide. But sometimes the decarbonization leader may be left on his own. And this is the problem if the political system does not really respond in the way we think, if individuals don't decarbonize the way we hope they'll do, the leader may be left in a very vulnerable position. Next slide. So what is it about politics that makes this happen? Well, here are some wise comments. Stephen Colbert says, it's often been said at the end of the day, every politician is human. But what about during the day? H.L. Mencken, Calvin Coolidge slept more than any other president. He had no ideas, but he was not a nuisance. Calvin Coolidge, if you don't say anything, you won't be called upon to repeat it. Will Rogers, a fool and his money are soon elected. And Art Spander said, the great thing about democracy is that it gives every voter a chance to do something stupid. So politics doesn't necessarily get us where we want to go, and that's too bad. So in summary, regions such as states, cities, large firms can be leaders in mitigation. They may get direct benefits from consumers, employees, and investors, or indirect benefits from green technology spillovers to reduce emissions for others around the world. They can be teaching others how to decarbonize. They can be politically active to get national climate action, or they can work cooperatively with other regions to achieve better outcomes. I see all this happening, but three of my grandsons are pretty pessimistic. They're looking at, in this picture, at a quiet lake with an open future, but they're very worried about what their future is. They tell me this all the time. Next slide. If we can tell them the problem has been solved, they'll be a lot happier. So thank you.
Thanks, Rob. I think we're seeing a little of the free rider problem at the federal level at the moment. So yeah, to be further considered in a bit. Arun, you have a little different take on things, so over to you.
Yeah, I really appreciate the talk that Robert gave. I hadn't seen the slides before. And I want to take this opportunity to thank Ken and Ram for inviting me for this event. And I have a few slides, but let me make a bold statement to start with, that if you really look at it globally, if you want to address climate change, I think it's going to be very hard to address at scale unless our actions improve the quality and security of human lives, both locally and worldwide. So Ken and Ram asked me the question, both how is it going in mitigation, and how do we go even deeper? And the second one, and I'm an engineer by training, so it was a leap of faith for them to ask me this, to see how to make adaptation a business imperative and create some parity in investments with mitigation. And I'll show some data on the cheaper and cleaner is now becoming a business imperative. And it reduces local pollution, which is improving the quality of lives, and it creates jobs and economic growth. On the adaptation one, I'm sorry, can you go back again? On the adaptation, it's a little harder because the challenges with extreme events, whether it's wildfire or droughts or extreme rainfall, they're local, and we don't have the tools to predict them well in advance. Weather predictions are typically about 10 days, maybe 14, whereas climate predictions are decades ahead. So there's some science and technology that needs to be developed, but we do understand some of the risks. And then the question becomes, into the previous presentation, the actions are common and public good. So, but they could be local. So who pays for it, what the free riders are. So the next slide. So this is just to show, and this is a very busy slide, but I'll just give you the upshot of this key takeaway. The biggest investment that we have had in this area from the government side is the Inflation Reduction Act. And and that's been on the order of, $400 billion, and it's still being, given out. But the idea was to stimulate the private sector to come in and invest more, and in fact, several X more. And this was the whole idea, because the amount of investments that are needed globally, for example, as predicted by or estimated by the International Energy Agency, is about $4 to $5 trillion per year for the next 30 years. So it's a lot of money. And I don't think the governments can do that. It has to be the private sector coming in. And the government's role is to create the environment for that to happen. And this was a really important step in that direction. And the Department of Energy comes up with a jobs report every year, the U.S. Energy and Employment Report. And I just put the numbers out there, but the bottom line is that the growth in jobs because of this, the electric power generation, transmission, distribution, despite some of the regulatory hurdles and permitting, et cetera, the job growth is faster in this than the general economic job growth. And that is a big outcome of not only the government investment, but frankly, more the private sector that came in, catalyzed by the government investment. So I think in that sense, this will become a policy framework to really stimulate the local economy. Next slide. And this is, if you think about where this is going and just the techno-economic trends, if you look at renewable electricity, it is now becoming cheaper than the electricity from fossil fuels. The dashed line is the natural gas. And in many, many parts of the world, including many parts of the United States. And, it is, when it's cheaper, then of course it's a natural thing to invest in that. And this has come about by some of the policy measures, both carrots and sticks. The carrots came from the federal government with the investment tax credit and production tax credit. And what California did with renewable portfolio standard, with the mandate, that combination became bankable. And that bankability led to financing. And that was a really important combination. And if you look at the Inflation Reduction Act, it's really all about carrots. There are very few sticks except for the methane tax that is there. Other than that, it's mostly carrots. If you look at and this is, by the way, a tectonic shift in the electricity industry. On the EVs side, on the transportation, there have been obviously tax credits and rebates, et cetera. But it's really about the cost of the battery. And the battery cost is coming down. It's came down really fast, which was not predicted before in the early 2008, 2009, when I was in the DOE that time. And if you see the red curve is $100 a kilowatt hour, is a marker. Because when the lithium-ion battery pack cost goes below that or approaches that, certainly when it's below that, the cost of the electric vehicle and the range of the electric vehicle becomes competitive with internal combustion engine without subsidies. And that is a tectonic shift in the EV industry. So if there's any car company that does not have an EV plan or some kind of a hybrid plan, I mean, that's going to be difficult for them in the future because this is a shift. And I think not enough spoken about is the LED lighting. The cost of the LED lighting has come down even faster than any of this. And that has changed the energy efficiency ballgame. So I think this is, in terms of investments, the combination of both carrots and sticks have been really, really helpful in bankability, and that has really brought the cost down. And now other countries and other regions will get the benefit of this, as Robert correctly pointed out. Next slide. But if you think that solar and wind and EVs, that's going to be enough for solving climate change, there's a lot more. And I'll very quickly go through other sort of approaches. Grid scale storage. We don't have a solution at scale yet that is cost competitive. And decarbonizing the industry, the steel and cement, very hard to decarbonize. And of course, we know from IPCC that if you don't remove CO2 from the atmosphere, we're not going to be able to address climate change 2 degrees Celsius. So while we have done well in sectorial things like electricity, we think we know how to decarbonize, the intersector things really have not yet fully flourished. And that is an opportunity for looking at is for technological innovation, for investments. And I just want to give you one example in terms of thinking about scale from the beginning. The next slide is about fuels. If you could go to the next slide. So despite all the developments and improvements that have happened in the electricity sector, oil, gas, and coal worldwide still provide about roughly 80% of the primary energy today. And if you don't address that, it'll be very difficult to really decarbonize and do mitigation. And so we need a fuel, a net zero fuel that is cheaper than fossil fuel at scale to really take the same kind of approach, because if it is cheaper, then it's an economic imperative, and that's when business pay attention to this. So the question, how do we do that? And I think it's very important to think about scale. And the next slide is about scale. If you look at the emissions from the various sectors, coal is about 8 gigatons of coal per year, producing 15.4, roughly 15 gigatons of CO2. Oil and gas is on the, if you combine it, it's about 5 gigatons of CO2. By the United States is about 5 gigatons as well. Steel, cement. And the other gigaton sector is agriculture. And agriculture absorbs in the crop residues is about 12 gigatons of CO2 absorbed from the atmosphere on an annual basis. Now, a lot of times the coal companies don't talk to the agricultural companies because they are in their silos. And I think it's very important as a next step to connect the dots. And let me give you the next slide. And here are some examples of potential innovations that could happen. The crop residues remove about 10 gigatons of CO2 per year. And many a times, many parts of the world, they just burn it without doing anything about it. And that leads to local air pollution and other things. And there's a lot of focus right now in California and other places on biochar. They, interestingly enough, they have the same properties of coal, but they cost roughly about $180 to $200 a ton. This is a potential for innovation if you could figure out a way to innovate to make it cheaper than $100 a ton. Why $100? Because that's the price of coal in the global market. So these are innovations that will then, because the scale matches up and it'll be cheaper, that's one way to displace the fossil fuel industry, and because it's just cheaper, which is what has happened in the electricity sector. Let me go quickly to the disasters and the adaptation. I think what Robert said was so beautifully done that I'll spend less time on this. There's no question, if you look at the data, that climate is affecting the various kinds of billion-dollar disasters and FEMA budgets, et cetera. Next slide. And this is certainly affecting people. These are, heat-related illnesses that are going on, the amount of the hospitalization. This is a public health issue. And this is United States. You can imagine in places, other parts of the world, where people don't have access to air conditioning, what the issues, the public health issue is really staggering out there. For example, in a country like India with 1.4 billion people, the percentage of people who have access to air conditioning is 8%. So 92% don't have access. So this becomes a really public health issue and a public good issue as well, if you can solve it. But on the United States, if you go to the next slide, I'll just quickly, the risk to homes and home insurance, and it's gone up dramatically since the early 1900s. And you go to the next slide. And that has really led to home insurance premiums going up and a lot of non-renewals that are happening. And I think this is a time to revisit code standards and insurance. And Robert also talked about that. And I think the insurance companies are sitting on roughly about $40 trillion of assets right now. And I think they're worried about the payout ratio. And now it's a risk reward. The question is, should they be investing in measures as a business opportunity to reduce the risks, like, of a community, and modulate the premiums based on behavior, on individual behavior, and thereby, promote the good behavior of people who may modulate. But some things are beyond human control, as was pointed out, and thereby this is an opportunity. And I think, yes, the public can kind of look at this as a public good, but should the public bear all the responsibility nationwide on things? These are questions that are critical. And if you look at what happened in the Superstorm Sandy and all the other things, I was just coming out of DOE at that time. There was a lot of discussion of this going on, but I don't think that has ended. That has only been aggravated. So let me stop here. Thank you very much, and happy to have the discussion.
Thanks, Arun. So much in that to think about. Would be great to have a little more time. But Nuantara, let's move on to you. And you, I think, have a very pragmatic approach to all of this. So looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Ken, and thanks to the organizers for the opportunity to be here today. I'm Nuantara Key, and I'm Executive Director of Programs at California Forward, which is a statewide nonprofit really working to build a new California economy that's sustainable, resilient, and inclusive, so people across every region and community can prosper both today and into the future. And today, building on the presentations that my fellow panelists have already shared, I am going to be talking about kind of how are we thinking about risk, and a little bit of a reframing, and as Ken was saying, hopefully kind of a practical kind of framework to think about how do we manage risk in a time of changing climate, and how do we think about that in context to funding and financing needs. So on this slide here, I know everybody here on this call here in this webinar or this event here today has a handle on these, but I think it's really helpful to just start with a framing on how have we managed climate risk and how have we thought about hazards historically. I think it's helpful to think about we can manage risk by reducing kind of exposure to that risk, by actively managing, for example, our forests to reduce catastrophic wildfires. Or we can think about relocating or moving infrastructure away from shorelines that are subject to sea level rise. We can invest in different types of infrastructure that help manage flooding. Those are all things that we can do to manage our exposure to the risk. But the next thing that we can do, and fellow panelists here talked about some of the things, importance of building codes in helping to mitigate with the risk. When you're not removing exposure, but how do you actually mitigate the risk itself? Building codes and zoning laws, incorporating natural cooling features into new buildings. And we talked about insurance, and I'll talk a little bit about this too, but insurers offering premium discounts for implementing safety measures. And then the next category is really managing the risk. And this is where things like traditional property-based insurance or national or federal state programs come into play, which are in place because there are going to be times where risk exists. You cannot fully reduce your exposure to it or reduce the underlying risk. So you have to make sure you have the right funding and financing available to manage events when they happen. So I just wanted to frame that as a starting point here, because this structure in how we think about those three kind of ways we can think about risk, we have set up financing and funding systems that are based on kind of a more stable climate. And as our climate risk profile is changing, as other speakers have talked about, I'm sure, across the day, we had many conversations, so I'm not going to spend too long talking about this slide. But I think as we're seeing these risk events increase in frequency, in severity, and the costs of the events like the devastating wildfires in LA in January, we really need to be thinking about risk differently and how we manage risk to be able to deploy funding and financing to reduce the underlying risk. Next slide, please. While we're, what we're thinking about and how we manage risk is one piece of it. The other piece that I think is really important for the context setting here too is that in addition to dealing with changing climate conditions, the risk profile is changing because of where and how we grow and develop. And both of those things need to be taken into consideration as we're thinking about how we're managing risk. And increasingly, the stats that are here on this slide are about California, but there's similar kind of national statistics around increased growth and development in high hazard areas. And, here, for example, over 80% of properties built in California between 2020 and 2022 were in high fire risk areas, compared with previous growth changes earlier in the last century that were in less fire risk areas. That is a product of both where and how we grow and develop and changing risk profiles. Next slide, please. The other thing that I think is really important for us to be thinking about is who holds the risk. And as my other panelists here have already highlighted, all sectors of the economy hold some piece of the risk, whether that's insurance companies who typically hold the risk for a 1-year interval. Policies typically are written for 1 year. Tenants, the average in the US is living in a location for about 3 years. So they are holding that risk for that portion of time. Property owners, while the average, mortgage is for 30 years, property ownership is usually about 13 years. And then lenders, again, typically 20 to 30 year kind of mortgage life, but in reality, they're really only holding that for an average in the US of about 8 years. But what's, I think, fundamental to how we think about climate risk and resilience and financing and funding is that at the end of the day, government owns that risk forever. Next slide, please. And as we're starting to see issues in the insurance market, not just in California, but across the country and other locations, it underscores the impact of growing climate risk. And, I'm not going to go over each of these quotes here. I think everybody is well familiar, I anticipate, with the kind of cascading and interrelated impacts of the insurance market instability and the relation and connection to wildfires and climate risk. But I think one of the things that's really important for us to be thinking about as we're thinking about financing and funding for adaptation is that our solutions cannot be only moving that risk increasingly to the public balance sheet. So at the bottom of this slide, you'll see, California's FAIR Plan, which is a state-funded insurer of last resort, has seen its plan exposure increase from insignificant proportion over the last number of years, rising to $460 billion in 2040. And what that means is as private insurers are moving and leaving the market, that risk actually isn't being reduced. It's getting transferred over to public balance sheets. Again, governments own that risk forever. Next slide, please. So what do we do about it? We need to think about the way we think about and protect about climate change has to change, because that risk borne, my worry, one of the things that keeps me up at night is that we're transferring the risk and those costs to public balance sheet while not making the commensurate investments in risk reduction and adaptation effectively enough. Next slide, please. So how do we think about this? I think it's really important that we think about making strategic investments in reducing and that top of the curve, which we can control and reduce as much as we can, while then figuring out by making sustained investment in resilience and adaptation, and then make sure we have the right financing and funding available to manage the tails and the risks that are increasing there. And just quickly, I think it was mentioned earlier that, we don't know exactly when an extreme event is going to happen. That's true. We can't predict that it's going to happen on a specific day in a given week. We know it is going to happen. And so we can take action to make sure we have the financing available to manage when those risks happen on the tails. And we can make strategic investments in resilience and adaptation to reduce the top of the curve to bring it down to more manageable levels. Next slide, please. So what do? I know we're running close here on time here for our session. So I just want to leave with a key message here, which is in that kind of pinkish purple box here, which is, we need sustained revenue for climate adaptation and investment. We have to be making significant and sustained investment to reduce that underlying risk at the top of the curve. And I know the last session before ours, the speakers were talking about different local funding and financing mechanisms. So there's a lot of solutions out there. And with that, I will stop and hand back to you, Ken.
Well, thanks for that. I hope everybody like me has like a million thoughts and a lot of questions. And we have all of about 30 seconds each for you to answer my question. And maybe we'll do it in the same order, Rob, Arun, and Tara. What in a very quick nutshell do you see as the biggest challenge resulting from the loss of federal participation? Rod?
Well, I think it's a terrible loss, really. It's going to impact all the collaboration we'd like to do with the whole world. We know that mitigation can only happen if we do it together, and we're doing our best to destroy those kind of collaborative relationships. If the United States was slow getting started, I think the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, really opened the door to active federal involvement in the U.S. California's been trying to do it on its own for actually more than a decade. But I think really the world is going to be, it's the whole pace of decarbonization is going to be hurt by the U.S. backing out.
Arun, anything to add?
I would just say that I think it's been well proven that the cost of inaction is more than the cost of action.
Yeah.
And climate change doesn't care about which political party in Washington. And so, as my former colleague and George Shultz here at Stanford used to say, at some point people will be mugged by reality. But that mugging can be pretty brutal.
Yes.
And that's what I worry about. But it will take, just like we saw in COVID, that the more you delay, the worse it gets in terms of action. And I know we'll come to it at some point, but I think California providing an example of how to get it done before the federal government pays attention. I think it's really, and there's a long history of California in the energy efficiency, all the appliance standards and all. I think it has to be a role model of how to address this at scale, because California is the 5th largest economy in the world. And I think that's, I would just appeal. I'm so proud to be a part of California, frankly.
So, Tara, last word.
Yeah, I think one of the big challenges that I see, and especially for our local government partners that are on the line here, I think it is putting more onus on local governments to find ways to fund and finance the work directly and not be as dependent on one-time or federal grant funding. And that's going to put a significant strain on existing and already strained local budgets. And I think that's a space where it is a major challenge, and I think local governments are really going to feel it. And I think we also, though, have some opportunities to think about that creatively to make sure resilience and adaptation is a part of all investments that we're making at a local level.
Well, thank you. Too short of a panel, but you guys did great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you all very much. That's the end of this session. But if you would please join the next from the lobby. Thank you. Thank you.